Nestled on the serene waterfront of Maryland, Cottage 506 looks like the perfect getaway. Rustic charm, stunning views, and part of a resort offering everything you could want for a relaxing retreat. But behind its picturesque exterior lies a chilling secret, one so dark that it has left a stain on the hearts of all who know it. This is the story of why I, and so many others, will never set foot in Cottage 506. On Valentine's Day in 1998, a married couple named Steve and Kim Rico held hands as they walked toward their car. They had just dropped their 8-year-old daughter off at a neighbor's house in their suburban neighborhood in Maryland, and now had the whole weekend to themselves. They were excited because they had a big trip planned. However, Kim had no idea what they would be doing because Steve had planned everything in secret. He wanted it to be a surprise. For weeks leading up to the weekend, Kim noticed Steve constantly on the phone, presumably making arrangements, but he wouldn't let her hear what he was saying. He would muffle his voice or hang up before she could listen in. Kim also saw Steve writing in his journal after these calls, likely jotting down details about the trip. The only thing Steve told Kim was to wear something nice. As they got into the car, Kim turned to Steve and asked, "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" Steve just grinned and said, "Nope, it's a surprise." Kim pretended to be frustrated, but inside she was thrilled. She was excited not only about the surprise, but also because Steve was making a big effort to make her happy, something that had been lacking in their relationship lately. Kim and Steve had been married for 9 years, and they were very different people. Steve was a homebody, introverted and quiet, while Kim was outgoing and social. When they first met, their differences had brought them together. Kim, in her early 20s, had just dropped out of college and had a history of short-lived relationships with men she met at parties or bars. But Steve was different. He was a gentle giant, 6 feet 4 inches, and a former football player who treated her with respect and loyalty. They quickly fell in love, and when Kim became pregnant, Steve proposed. Kim didn't hesitate to say yes. Their marriage brought stability to Kim's life. She went back to college, earned her degree, and became a surgical technician. Steve was a fantastic father who stayed home with their daughter while Kim worked. Kim often laughed at the sight of Steve, this massive man cradling their tiny baby like a toy. But over the past year, Steve had changed. He went from being shy but functional to becoming almost a recluse. He refused to go out, didn't want to see friends or family, and spent most of his time at home watching TV or hanging out in the basement. It was clear he was depressed, but his behavior was suffocating Kim. She suggested therapy, even couples therapy, but Steve refused. By New Year's, Kim had had enough. She was unhappy and didn't believe Steve would change, so she told him she wanted a divorce. This shocked Steve, who hadn't realized how serious the situation had become. He begged Kim to give him another chance, promising to change. Kim agreed, which led to Steve planning this secret getaway on Valentine's Day, a trip meant to be the start of their renewed relationship. Kim was hopeful and excited about the future. After driving for about an hour and a half, Steve pulled off the highway and followed signs toward the Eastern Shore, a beautiful waterfront area of Maryland about 70 miles from their home. They arrived at the Harbor Town Golf Resort, and when Steve parked the car, he clapped his hands and said, "Okay, we're here." Kim smiled, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds and the beautiful resort. She was excited and eager to see what Steve had planned. Hand in hand, they checked in, and the receptionist handed them glasses of champagne. They were told that their cottage, Cottage 506, was the nicest property at the resort. Kim and Steve were thrilled. They drove a little further into the resort to their cottage, which overlooked the water. Inside, Kim was wowed by the rustic suite with a wood fire stove, 2 queen-sized beds, and a cozy breakfast area. It was perfect. As she explored the cottage, Kim noticed a card on a table that looked like a wedding invitation. Confused, she glanced at Steve, who smiled and said, "Go check it out." Kim picked up the card and began reading. It was indeed a wedding invitation, but for a fake wedding. Steve had purchased a romantic getaway package that included this amazing cottage and a professional dinner theater performance at the resort. The show was a murder mystery called The Bride Who Cried, where the actors would stage a wedding, and at the end, someone would be killed. The audience would then have to figure out who the killer was. For an extrovert like Kim, this was perfect. She was touched that Steve had planned something so tailored to her interests. After reading the invitation, Kim turned to Steve and with a big smile hugged him tightly. Steve was relieved and happy that Kim was pleased. The couple spent the next few hours by the fire, drinking champagne, talking about the future and sharing stories. Around 7 p.m., they dressed in their nicest clothes and walked to the event hall where the dinner theatre was taking place. The room was set up with round tables for the audience, and the actors, dressed in wedding attire, mingled with the guests, including Steve and Kim. As the play began, Kim was immediately absorbed. She enthusiastically interacted with the actors and other guests, pretending she was part of the wedding. The play's plot centered around a groom in the mafia who was forcing his bride to marry him by threatening her family. The climax came when the groom gave a toast with champagne, took a sip, and then collapsed, dead. Kim watched with delight, but she kept glancing at Steve, hoping he was enjoying it too. However, each time she looked at him, he seemed stone-faced and uninterested. When Kim leaned over to ask him who he thought the killer was, Steve ignored her, completely zoned out. Despite this, Kim continued to enjoy the show. Eventually, Kim and a few other enthusiastic audience members figured out that the bride's mother had poisoned the groom. After the play ended and the audience began to leave, Kim couldn't help but feel annoyed with Steve. He had been so silent and disengaged despite coming all this way. But she reminded herself that Steve had put a lot of effort into planning the weekend, and she didn't want to start a fight. Instead, Kim suggested they go to the bar, get a couple of drinks, and take them back to their cottage. Steve smiled and agreed. By the time they reached the front door of Cottage 506, they were holding hands, laughing and sharing stories again. They went inside and Steve set the beers down on the table. Kim told him she was going to change into something more comfortable and walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Steve then walked to the front door and locked it. 3 hours later, a man named Philip Parker, who was staying at the resort with his family, heard a commotion in the lobby. People were saying there might be a fire at Cottage 506 and that someone could still be inside. Philip immediately turned to his cousin, and the two of them ran toward Cottage 506. As they approached, they saw black, oily smoke pouring out of the windows. When they reached the cottage, Philip ran to the front door, but it was locked. He screamed to see if anyone was inside, but there was no answer. Philip and his cousin then ran around to the back, where there was a glass sliding door. Philip tried the handle, but it was locked. His cousin ran back to the resort to get a fire extinguisher, while Philip noticed that the sliding door opened on both ends. He had only checked one side, which was locked, but the other side was slightly open. Philip quickly opened the door and smoke began billowing out. He dropped to the floor to get a better look because the smoke hadn't fully settled at the bottom. Through the air pocket, Philip saw someone's feet in the middle of the bedroom. He screamed that he was coming in and began low-crawling into the room, coughing and hacking from the smoke. When he reached the person, he grabbed their foot and shook them, but they didn't respond. The fire was growing and the smoke was thickening, so Philip, panicking, grabbed the person's leg and started dragging them out. It was difficult, but he managed to pull the person to the door. However, he couldn't lift them over the door's threshold. At that moment, Philip's cousin returned, and together they managed to drag the person out of the cottage. When Philip finally got a good look at who he had just saved, he realized it was too late. The person was already dead, their face completely burned away. In the days and weeks leading up to the weekend, Steve really had been taking secret phone calls and writing notes in his journal because he was planning something special. But he wasn't the only one with plans for this weekend. Here's what the police say happened. After Kim and Steve returned to their cottage following the show, Kim went into the bedroom to change while Steve locked the front door. A few minutes later, Kim emerged from the bedroom wearing something sexy, smiled at Steve and said, "Come on, get in bed. I'll join you in a second." Steve, thinking his plan was working, climbed into bed laying down. Kim walked over, got something from her bag, and then returned to the bed. Suddenly she pulled out a syringe and stabbed Steve with it before he could react, injecting him with a drug called succinylcholine. Kim had access to this drug through her job as a surgical technician. Succinylcholine is used to relax muscles during surgery, but a large dose can stop a person's breathing. The drug works almost instantly, meaning Steve would have been paralyzed but fully conscious. He would have watched his wife put down the syringe, grab a bottle of lighter fluid, and calmly pour it over his face and chest. One of the last things Steve likely saw before he died was his wife striking a match and setting him on fire. After lighting Steve on fire, Kim casually walked out of the back sliding door, leaving it slightly open. She then went to the resort lobby where she acted concerned and claimed her cottage was on fire, with her husband still inside. Philip overheard Kim, prompting him and his cousin to run to the cottage, where they found Steve's body. Kim never intended to give Steve a second chance in their marriage. She was already having an affair with a much younger Marine and was done with Steve. While Steve was telling friends and family about his plans to save his marriage, Kim was openly talking about wanting to kill her husband, though no one took her seriously. When news broke of Steve's death in the fire, people rushed to the police, certain that Kim had something to do with it. Kim was convicted of her husband's murder and sentenced to life in prison. It turned out that the primary reason Steve was so secretive before the trip was that he wanted it to be an unbelievably special, romantic recreation of their first date. He had been calling Kim's friends and family, asking about her favorite things, trying to incorporate her interests into the trip. When Steve wrote in his journal, it wasn't just about logistics. He also wrote about how much he loved Kim, how excited he was about their future, and what they would build together as a family. Steve truly believed they were on a path to reconciliation, but sadly, that wasn't the case.